The camp arrived before the children did. Every summer, in the first weeks of June, the counselors came. They drove up the dirt camp road or climbed off the train at whichever small station served the lake nearest their camp, found the cabin row, and began making a bunk their own. The pine smell of the building, the wooden floor still carrying the faint memory of last summer's traffic, the screen doors banging once in the quiet air and then settling still. Most counselors in this era were between 18 and 22 years old. Many of them had been campers at this very camp, had slept in these same top bunks, walked this same trail to the waterfront, sat at the same long dining hall tables waiting for the breakfast bell. They came back now on the other side of the experience. No longer the children who had lived in the cabin, but the people responsible for the children who were about to. The pre-session staff period ran 1 to 2 weeks at most. Private and organizational camps across the post-war decades. Accounts from camp directors and former counselors from this era describe a week of waterfront certification, first aid review, program planning, and the camp director's statement of what this particular place was trying to build in its campers. What no staff week could teach was the specific knowledge that distinguished a counselor in their first summer from one in their third. What day 3 looked like from the outside, or how to read a first-year camper's silence differently from a returning camper's silence. That knowledge wasn't in any document. It moved between counselors informally, in conversations at the edge of the waterfront, in the quiet, after lights out in the cabin. For those who had grown up inside this institution, who had been campers here before they were staff, the staff week had a quality of return that a first-year counselor wouldn't feel. The cabin at the end of the row was familiar. The trail to the dock was the trail they had walked since they were 9. The buses came on a Sunday. At camps across the Adirondacks and through the lake regions of New England, the arrival of the first session was one of the most consistent rituals in the calendar, documented in camp brochures, described in letters home, remembered for decades by the people who had been on both sides of it. The bus turned up the camp road. The counselors walked out to meet it. What happened in the next hour was the beginning of everything the counselors' summer would require of them. Children climbed out of buses carrying duffel bags and wearing expressions that ranged from barely contained excitement to something quieter. They had left parents at a train station or a parking lot. Some of them had been at this camp before and were already looking for the faces they knew. Some of them had never been away from home for more than a night. A counselor watching that arrival, watching the children cross from the world of their parents into the world of the camp, was watching the beginning of the developmental passage they had come here to guide. The cabin assignment, the walk to the bunk, the trunk arriving, the first meal together in the dining hall. These were not logistical tasks. They were the first structure the counselor offered the new community of the cabin, the first reliable rhythm in an environment that was, for many of these children, genuinely unfamiliar. The first night in the bunk was its own passage. Lights out was not the end of the counselor's day. After the last lamp went off and the cabin settled, many counselors lay awake listening to the sounds of the building, the screen door moving in the lake breeze, the particular breathing of 8 children adjusting to a new place. They were listening for the specific quality of sound that indicated everything was all right, or the quality that indicated it was not. That distinction, new to a first-year counselor, became second nature by the third summer. The counselor's day began before the campers were awake. By the time the morning bell rang across the camp, typically between 6:30 and 7, the counselor had been up for a few minutes, if not longer. The first task was the cabin. Wake the group. Oversee the daily cleanup that most camps required before the morning inspection. Beds made, floor swept, footlockers closed. Then walk the group to breakfast. Sit at the end of the long dining hall table. Watch who was talking and who was not. Activity periods followed. Depending on the program and the cabin assignment, the counselor accompanied their group to the waterfront, the archery range, the craft cabin, or the athletic field. Their roles shifted with the activity. At the waterfront, they watched and counted. In crafts, they assisted. In sports, they organized. The constant across all of it was presence. The counselor's physical proximity to the group from morning bell through the evening program. Rest hour, in the early afternoon, was the one period in the camp day when the schedule was quiet. Campers were in or near their bunks. For the counselor, it was the time to catch up on the administration of the group, noting who might need attention, writing to parents if that was required, or simply being available near the cabin in case something surfaced that the busyness of the morning had concealed. Evening program brought the full camp together, then returned each cabin to itself for the walk back through the dark, the last check of the group's condition, and lights out. After lights out, the counselors' formal day ended, but they did not always sleep. Accounts from former counselors of this era describe lying in the dark at the end of the bunk row, thinking through the day's details, who had held back at lunch, which friendship in the cabin was shifting, what tomorrow's waterfront session would require of a particular child who was still uncertain in the water. It was an informal, unrequired practice. It was also how the knowledge grew. The waterfront was the center of the camp counselor's program responsibility. At residential camps built on northern lakes, the Adirondacks, Maine, the Great Lakes region, the lake country of Wisconsin and Minnesota, the waterfront was where more of the camp's daily life was organized than any other single space. Swimming instruction, canoe trips, rowing, the daily free swim. Each of these required a counselor who was present at the dock's edge, watching, counting, and reading, continuously aware of the group's condition in the water. The morning swim test was, in many camps, the counselor's first formal introduction to their group's range. Who went into cold water without hesitation? Who stood at the dock's edge longer than necessary before getting in? Who was already comfortable in a canoe, and who had never held a paddle? These were not simply assessments of physical skill. They were the first pieces of information about the specific children in this specific cabin that would inform the counselor's attention for the rest of the session. Canoe instruction gave the counselor and the child a particular kind of encounter. There was something specific to the canoe, the balance required, the feedback from the water, the fact that the stern set the course and had to be trusted by the bow, that arrived in children at different speeds and in different forms. A counselor who had been canoeing on this lake since they were 9 years old knew how to read the moment when the child in the bow found their balance, because they remembered that moment from the inside. They had been there. They recognized it on someone else. The waterfront also produced a daily social geography that the counselor read constantly. Who chose to swim with whom? Who stayed near the dock? Who went as far out as permitted and waited there alone? The water told the counselor things the dining hall didn't, because the dining hall had chairs and tables and a structure that could be navigated by a child who knew how to navigate structure. The water just had the child. Rest hour happened in the early afternoon, typically after lunch and before the next activity period, and it was one of the few moments in the camp day when the structure released enough pressure for what was actually happening in the cabin to become visible. The prescribed routine was simple: campers in or near their bunks, quiet activity permitted, no organized programming. In practice, rest hour was the period when a homesick child's condition surfaced most clearly, because it was the period with the least distraction. It was also, at many camps, the time when the Sunday letter was written. What an unfinished letter, on a bunk at 2:30 in the afternoon of the third day, told an experienced counselor, was something specific. Not that the child couldn't write, not that they lacked things to say. It was that the letter they had started on day one, when the things they knew how to say about camp were still the things they had imagined from home, was no longer accurate, and they hadn't yet found what was accurate instead. The camp had become real enough to be incompatible with the version of it they had begun to describe. The new version hadn't organized itself into words yet. A first-year counselor would be likely to notice that the letter was unfinished and offer to help, or not notice at all. An experienced counselor knew to register it and give the child time. What the letter needed was not completion. What the child needed, what the camp was organized to provide, whether or not it announced itself as doing so, was the particular thing that arrived by the end of the first week without being given, the belonging that comes from having been somewhere long enough to be part of it. The counselor, who had been that child, on that third day, with that letter on their own bunk, already knew this. That was the core of the knowledge that no orientation had been able to install. Evening program at American residential camps in this era typically ran for an hour or two after dinner, before the return to cabins and lights out. It was the part of the camp day that belonged most fully to the community as a whole, rather than to the cabin group, and the counselor's role within it shifted accordingly, from manager and guide to participant and observer. At many northeastern private camps and organizational camps in the post-war decades, the campfire was the center of the evening program at least once or twice a week. Accounts from former campers and counselors describe a gathering that was both structured and informal. The full camp assembled at the fire ring, songs that everyone knew, started by a counselor or a senior camper, stories told by the director or a member of the staff. The fire and the dark around it created conditions for a quality of attention that the dining hall and the athletic field did not. The counselor who led a cabin group to the campfire and sat among them at the fire's edge was doing something specific. They were visible to the children as someone who participated in the shared ritual rather than supervised it. The distinction was small but consequential. For the child who still held back at mealtimes, who hadn't yet found their way into the cabin's social life, the campfire offered a form of belonging that didn't require any individual social risk. You could be part of it just by being present and by knowing, eventually, the words to the songs. What the counselor knew, and what the child learned across the weeks, was that the campfire repeated, the songs repeated, the fire and the dark and the lake reflecting light at the edge of the circle repeated. This repetition built something in both of them, in the child, the beginning of ownership of the ritual, in the counselor, a knowledge of how the ritual moved through a group over the course of a summer. What distinguished a counselor in their third summer from a counselor in their first wasn't a credential. It wasn't anything that could be documented in a training record or assessed by a camp director's review. It was the specific weight of observation, the accumulated knowledge of what the same arc looked like in different children, across different summers, from the outside. A first-year counselor managed each situation as it arose. They had the resources of their own camp experience, their common sense, and whatever the staff orientation had offered. When a child in the cabin was homesick on day 4, the first-year counselor had an impulse to comfort, to distract, to encourage, and they followed the impulse because they had nothing more specific to follow. A counselor in their third summer didn't manage situations. They read them before the situations fully arrived. The child who came to breakfast on day 3 and ate without speaking wasn't a problem yet. They were a specific point in a passage the counselor had watched many times, the transition from the initial shock of being away to the comprehension of how long away would actually be. The counselor knew what that point required. Not comfort, which addressed the wrong thing, not distraction, which did the same, something closer to steady presence, the consistent fact of the counselor still being there, tomorrow and the day after, which was what the passage needed most, and what the child couldn't quite believe in yet. This knowledge hadn't been given to them. They had built it from 3 summers of watching children move through the passage, from remembering what they themselves had needed on day 3 when they were 10 years old at this camp, and from the slow accumulation of something that no curriculum had been designed to produce. It was what the camp had built in them, while they were building something in the children. The cabin community was not a family. It was not a classroom. It was not a friendship group, because the children in it had not chosen each other. It was something the camp had constructed from 6 to 8 children who had been placed together by a process they had no part in, who were required to sleep 12 feet from each other every night, eat at the same table 3 times a day, and navigate the same daily schedule for 8 weeks. What that arrangement produced, and what the counselor presided over without directing it, was the specific social education of proximity. The children in the bunk learned who their cabin mates were not, from information exchanged in a controlled setting, but from sustained exposure, from watching how a person behaved at breakfast when they were tired, or at the waterfront when they were nervous, or at the campfire when the song they knew came around. The counselor's craft in all of this was mostly invisible. They organized the cabin's physical space. They managed conflict when it passed the threshold from ordinary friction into something requiring intervention, and left it alone when it hadn't. They arranged the daily schedule so that the children who needed more time together had it, and gave those who needed distance the routine distance of the camp's structured activities. None of this was explicit. It happened through the daily decisions of a person who lived in the cabin and watched, from 12 feet away, how the group moved through each week of the summer. By the final weeks of a long session, the cabin had often become something specific and irreplaceable, a community that the children who were in it did not fully recognize as exceptional until they were outside it. The counselor recognized it. They had watched it come together, had built part of it without naming what they were building, and knew that when the session ended, this particular community would not exist again. The final week of a long session had a different quality from any other week in the summer. The camp knew what was coming. The children knew what was coming. And the counselor, by the third or fourth summer at this camp, knew what the final week required of them, in a way that the first summer had not prepared them for. The trunk packing began. Children retrieved the list they had brought from home in June and compared it with what had accumulated in the footlocker across 8 weeks. The crafts made, the badges earned, the letters received, the equipment worn soft at the edges. The cabin cleaned out in the reverse of the process it had filled. The things that had been unpacked with some ceremony in the first hours of the session were packed up with less, because packing was the wrong direction. What the final week produced in the cabin community depended on what the summer had produced. A cabin group that had built something real, across 8 weeks, arrived at the last week with a social world it did not want to lose. The knowledge that Friday was coming changed the texture of each day. The final canoe trip, the last campfire, the last meal in the dining hall. Each of these carried a weight that the earlier instances of the same ritual had not. The counselor's role in the final week was different from their role in any earlier week. They were still the person who ran lights out and oversaw the packing and walked the group to the last evening program. But they were also managing their own transition. After 8 weeks of living 12 feet from 8 children, watching them move through the arc of the session, building the knowledge of this particular group that would not apply to any future group, the counselor was also leaving something behind. The final day was usually Sunday. The buses came in the morning. The buses came, and the camp emptied in the particular way camps empty at the end of a session, quickly and all at once, with the specific residue of a world that had been real and was now dissolving. Children climbed on with their bags. Parents waited in parking lots and station platforms. The camp road was quiet by mid-morning. The counselor stayed a day or two longer. There was the physical work of closing the cabin, stripping the bunks, stowing the equipment, writing the end-of-session reports that some camp directors required. Then the counselor left too, carrying back to college or to home the particular weight of 8 weeks that no other 8 weeks in their life would quite replicate. What the summer had left in them was not easily named. Former counselors from this era, describing their summers decades later, reach for a specific vocabulary. The word accountability appears frequently. So does patience. So does something harder to name, a knowledge of what human beings require from each other at specific developmental moments, built from close observation and from memory of being inside the same moments themselves. In many cases, what the summer had built was something that persisted in unusual ways, in how they taught, in how they led, in how they responded to a colleague struggling with something they recognized from 30 years earlier in a different form. The camp had been, for the counselor who returned across several summers, a sustained education in a particular kind of attention, the kind that watches without directing, that knows when to act and when to wait, that understands that the most important things it organizes are rarely the things it announces. People like them staffed lakeside summer camps across the Adirondacks, New England, and the Great Lakes region for 6 decades of American life, sleeping in the bunk at the end of the row, staying awake a little longer than anyone required, watching the children move through the summer and knowing, because they remembered being there, that the season mattered.